In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to live in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. So begins the story of Ruth in the Old Testament book that bears her name. Here's a few more verses. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, and they were Epaphrodites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went to the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. When they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, so that the woman was left without her sons and without her husband. Then she started to return with her daughters-in-law from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had considered his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she had been living, she and her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on their way to go back to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her daughters-in-law, "Go back each of you to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find security, each of you in the house of your husband." And then she kissed them, and they wept aloud. They said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Do I still have sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. And even if I thought there was hope for me, even if I should have a husband tonight and bear sons, would you then wait until they were grown? Would you then refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, it's been more bitter for me than for you, because of the hand of the Lord has turned against me." Then they wept again. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. So she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die. There I will be buried. May the Lord do this and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you." When Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. So Naomi takes Ruth home with her, back to Bethlehem. Naomi returns to her hometown in shame. She felt that her life was empty, no husband, no children, no grandchildren. Remember, in these days, women were considered property. It's really odd that the main characters of this story are women, because they were not featured in this society. In fact, the theme of female empowerment and boundary pushing goes throughout the entire narrative. It makes us pause. It causes us to wonder what's really going on here. Women were valued as producers of children, male children. Having boys was a sign of being blessed by God or favored by God. Similarly, for a woman not to have children, to be barren, was possibly the worst thing possible. Having daughters, almost as much so. Losing one's husband and sons were a sure sign of not only being out of favor with God, but of even being cursed by God. Naomi was so stricken by her situation, so embarrassed, she begged people back home not to call her Naomi, but to call her bitter. For Naomi, Ruth's companionship and commitment to their relationship offered a glimmer of hope. If Ruth could attract the attention of one of Naomi's relatives, the odd Jewish law of levirate marriage could be called upon. There was a chance that her life could be salvaged, that it could be redeemed, that the two women would not have to live hand to mouth. Levirate marriage laws were in place not for the women, however, but to provide a place for a man to protect a male's legacy through heirs. If a married Jewish man died without male children, the law stated that his closest male relative must marry the wife. And yes, multiple wives were allowed. And he should care for her. And they must try together to have a son. And that son would be not the heir to the new husband, but the heir to the dead man. An heir so that his name could live on and lineage could continue. If you recall the rest of Ruth and Naomi's story, in Bethlehem, Naomi discovered this wealthy relative Boaz, and she instructed Ruth to go and glean from his field. There were also laws in place instructing farmers not to try to harvest every bit of food that was produced, but to intentionally leave about 10% of what was being harvested for the poor to gather. Such a practice was called gleaning. A question to consider later: what would gleaning look like in our society today? What would it look like for us to take this into practice as a congregation? I don't know if it's even relevant, but it's an interesting thing to think about. As we can surmise from the story, gleaning back then wasn't the wonderful panacea that we might assume that it should be. In reality, those who gleaned were in danger. They were often abused by other workers or people who came along in the fields. And Boaz encourages multiple times his workers not to mess with Ruth, not to accost her, not to harass her, but even more so to toss out a little bit extra for her to pick up as they harvested. Ruth must have caught his eye early on. A few days later, Naomi noticed this and instructs Ruth to bathe herself, make herself beautiful, and go at night to Boaz and seduce him. The term uncover his feet that is used in this story is a euphemism for sex. Ruth does as she was asked. She and Boaz spend the night together, and the next day, Boaz, impressed by this woman, goes to a close next of kin, someone even closer to Naomi than he was, to try to work out a deal so that Boaz can marry her. And the other man seems glad to be rid of the responsibility because he doesn't want the financial burden that Ruth might bring. Ruth and Boaz get married. Ruth has a son. They name him Obed. The story is vital in Jewish history because several generations later, King David comes about through this lineage. And many more generations later, Jesus emerges through this line. It's just interesting to note that the son born to Boaz and Ruth is not credited to them. No, the townspeople surround Naomi and declare a son has been born to Naomi, not to Boaz and not to Ruth. We see that though the book is called Ruth, it's really a story centered on Naomi. Naomi's pain, Naomi's frustration and hopelessness, and then her restoration. The narrative has so many twists and turns that the inattentive reader might miss them, and even people who've been reading it for decades miss some of the unexpected things that are there. Jamie Clark Soules presents an incredible group of observations about this story that I had never considered before in her interpretation commentary called Women in the Bible. It's profound. The story should have gone very differently if people in this narrative had acted and reacted like we might expect them to. It's ironic that Naomi and her husband left Bethlehem, which literally means house of bread, because of a famine. There was no bread in the house of bread. Naomi and her husband didn't go to another part of Israel, but to pagan lands, forbidden lands, cursed lands. They went to live among the Moabites, people who were hated and feared by the Israelites. People will do crazy things when survival is at stake. Have you noticed that? To make matters worse, Naomi's Jewish sons married Moabite women. Ruth, after whom the book is named, was a Moabite, not an Israelite. We know this is an essential part of the story because it's mentioned so many times in the text. It's as if the writer is saying to us, don't miss this. I've often wondered if Jesus had this story in mind about his great, on and on, grandparents, when he told the story of the Good Samaritan, a foreigner, an alien, a pagan choosing to assist an Israelite and becoming the hero of the story. Naomi's sons broke Jewish law by marrying foreigners who worship pagan gods. The story takes a sudden tragic twist that's reminiscent of the story of Job when all the men in the story die. Some might have said that the death of Naomi's husband and Ruth's husband was due to God's punishment for such unlawful behavior. If not blaming God, the men's deaths could easily have been dismissed by people in Bethlehem of, well, they got what they deserved. They should have known better than to run off and marry the first women who caught their eyes. And then they might have added, Naomi had the gall to bring that foreign homewrecker back here to Bethlehem, to God's place. What is she thinking? Why are we so quick to point fingers, to seek blame, to want a cause and effect answer for everything? But this story doesn't go quite like that, does it? I wonder, what does this story say to us today? Anything in our context, in our culture, in our current situation? There's so many folks migrating around the world and especially coming to our southern borders. Does this have anything to say about that? Yes, like Job, it's a story of how Naomi and Ruth, people of faith, might act and react when tragedy envelops their lives. Like Job's story, it gives permission to cry out to God with our pain and our complaints. This is also a story that pushes boundaries. It's a story where the characters ignore laws and traditions to do what they think is best for their family in the moment. It's a story where the characters use existing laws to their advantage, but at the same time ignore or flaunt accepted morals for the sake of salvation or saving face or redeeming a legacy. We hold up Ruth and Naomi as heroines, but ignore or try to explain away their morally or ethically questionable behavior. For some reason, we try to protect the reputations of these characters by whitewashing the story. We've made the story into a romantic tale that we tell our children. We even use portions of this narrative in weddings, leaving out the sketchy details and focusing only on this deep commitment Ruth made to Naomi. But this relationship is a special one, isn't it? Again, it's not what is expected in a story from that time and place. It would even be a weird story today. Culture jokes about mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law abound. Orpah's choice to return home is the normal outcome. It's what we would expect. It would have been the wisest path for Ruth to go home to her parents or to her mother, as the story says. Why in the world would she have chosen to travel to a country where she would have been known as an outcast and be labeled as a foreigner and possibly a pariah? It was either really bad back home or there must have been an incredible connection between Ruth and Naomi. And I tend to think it may be a little bit of both. But Ruth chose Naomi. She didn't choose because of her place or status. She chose because of relationship. Ruth believed that she was better off with Naomi, and Naomi was better off with Ruth than with either of them trying to make it alone. This brings to mind a quote by Luciano de Crescenzo. "We are each of us angels with only one wing, and we can only learn to fly by embracing one another." That was so true for Ruth and Naomi. Together, they were better. Together, they felt they could face any challenge. But what do we learn from this story? What is our takeaway today? How can we apply this beyond the romantic sentiment used at weddings? Is there more to it for us? Ultimately, I think for us, this is a story about justice and redemption. It's a critique of the preferential ways that justice was reserved only for family or only when financially beneficial for those involved. Once they got settled in Bethlehem, Naomi's closest relative chose not to marry Ruth because it might end up costing him financially. Boaz was a distant relative, but he chose to do the right thing. Sure, there was a beautiful woman in it for him, but I think it was much more than that. I think Boaz was a good man who wanted to do the right thing, to live the faith he claimed to believe. The story is both about doing whatever it takes for the sake of survival and family, as Naomi and Ruth did, but it's also about doing what is right to care for those on the fringes of society, like Boaz did, like others in the community did when they surrounded Naomi with love and care. It's about not overlooking those that are living in poverty. The ending shows us that amazing things can come from people we might otherwise ignore. It shows us that our biases are often wrong, or at least are misplaced or skewed. It shows us that a little kindness, a little creativity, perhaps a little conniving and pushing of boundaries or breaking of the rules for the sake of justice, for the sake of the least of these, is not only permissible, but is advisable by scriptures. But most of all, I think the story shows us the value of unexpected, even mismatched relationships. It shows us the value of community and how when the community functions as it should, all are cared for. All have enough. All are able to thrive. It's a story about how the community has a role in healing and restoration. Note that after Obed was born, the community gave him his name, not Ruth, not Boaz, not Naomi. The community. It's a story about the main characters acting in heroic ways, yes, but also it's a story about the way a faith community is designed to embrace all people, those on the inside and those on the outside. These two women from two vastly different cultures, different worldviews, different religious backgrounds, two women who should have never met, chose to join their lives together for each other's sake. And because of their commitments and the community's response, their situation was changed. And even our world today was changed because of their choices. Our family loves musicals. Perhaps you've noticed with all the illustrations I use from them in my sermons. We enjoy going to live productions, but also watching movie versions on TV of musicals and even having sing-alongs with them on certain movie nights. We invite friends over to do that. It's a lot of fun. But we also listen to musical soundtracks on repeat in the car when we travel. One of our favorite musicals to do that with is Wicked. We've seen it a few times live and have listened to it more times than is possible to count. Karen and I even dressed up as two of the characters one Halloween a few years back. Here's a picture. The story of Wicked is a retelling of The Wizard of Oz that focuses on the witches in the story, Glinda and Elphaba. In the traditional story, Glinda is the good witch and Elphaba, the green one, is the bad witch. But this story is about the relationship that began in school. Glinda initially saw Elphaba as a project to help her become refined and popular, but over time a deep friendship developed between these two women. My favorite song from the musical is For Good. And I think it could be sung by Ruth and Naomi. It's a great story that in the musical twists what we think we know from The Wizard of Oz into a new meaning and a whole new light. Here are a few lyrics from that song. I've heard it said that people come into our lives for a reason, bringing something we must learn, and we are led to those who help us most to grow if we let them, and we help them in return. Well, I don't know if I believe that's true, but I know I'm who I am today because I knew you. Like a comet pulled from orbit as it passes a sun, like a stream that meets a boulder halfway through the wood, who can say if I've been changed for the better? But because I knew you, I've been changed for good. Wouldn't it be wonderful if that song could be sung by everyone who comes to Millage Avenue Baptist Church? Wouldn't it be wonderful if folks that each of us encounter came away saying, wow, I am so glad I met them. Because I knew her, my life is changed for good. As Karen and Stephanie sing For Good, ponder about your relationships. Think about the way that God might use you to make a difference in another person's life. Ask God to give you opportunities to come alongside someone, maybe even someone you don't have much in common with at first blush. How can you help someone else be all that God has created them to be? And how can others help you in the same way? And how can you be open to those kinds of changes? Listen to this.
I've heard it said that people come into our lives for a reason, bringing something we must learn, and we are led to those who help us most to grow if we let them, and we help them in return. Well, I don't know if I believe that's true, but I know I'm who I am today because I knew you. Like a comet pulled from orbit as it passes the sun, like a stream that meets a boulder halfway through the wood. Who can say if I've been changed for the better? But because I knew you, I have been changed for good.
Thanks, Karen and Stephanie. I appreciate y'all singing that for us. Let's pray together. God, it is so wonderful to have stories like this that we can read and get new meaning from each time we dive into the narrative. God, give us new understandings of your word. Give us new understandings of this story and see how we may be able, through our relationships with others, just doing the little things can make a difference in their lives, and by doing that, make a difference in our lives too. Grant us the grace to see these opportunities and give us the courage to step out, to reach out, to be change for good in people's lives, as Jesus was in our life. In Christ's name, amen.